Hey, how's it going, everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and I'm starting a series on testing. And this will be the first video, and it's just basically how to get up and running with testing in React. But look for more testing videos to come on how to test with MobX, Redux, React Router, asynchronous code, testing the DOM, and a lot of different scenarios like that. But I hope you enjoy the first video, and please subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to create a playlist just to put all this testing series videos. Take care. Bye. Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we have a quick video on basically how to get up and running with testing in React, specifically Create React App. I'm going to go over sort of a few simple tests just to get us going and some packages we're going to need. But this is just to show the app that we're going to be working with. It's a little React app that I used for a React workshop I ran recently in Toronto. It's your typical weather app, but I'll show you the component we're going to be testing. So we're going to just search Toronto. Get this nice man shaving someone's beard. But anyway, see this little box over here with the 2 degrees Celsius in Toronto? This is the component we're going to be testing. It is called the temperature component. And it's got a little bit of functionality. If you click it, it triggers over this animation here to show the weekly forecast, and you can click it again to toggle that off the screen. So this is just to show the component and app we're going to be working with. So let's go look at the code. So we come in here, and in the components folder within SRC, we've got the temperature component. Here we're importing React, prop types, and some styled components. If you haven't used styled components before, it's basically just a way within React to write your CSS this way, sort of make it look like a component. But really it's just applying styles to a div and whatnot. So below we're exporting the temperature component, and inside we've got some prop types. So we are receiving a temp, which is the number that's displayed, it's required. The city that it's in, so it's in Toronto or whatnot. A function, which is called toggle forecast. So here's what the render function does, is it returns temperature box. This is just a styled div that positions it down in the bottom right of the screen. And on click, it calls the toggle forecast function. Inside, we've got a large text component that shows the temp prop along with the degrees symbol and C. And then we've got some small text which shows the city underneath. So this is the whole component, and that's what we're going to be testing. So in React, it comes with Jest pre-installed. Jest is a testing framework that's really popular in React, and I think it's made by Facebook, which is probably why they included it in React, but we can just use it. So if we come in here, we're going to create our first test, and we're going to name it the same name as the component we're testing, .test.jsx. So this won't be the test we're eventually going to write, but just to show you the format of it, we call the it function, and it is basically the function you use anytime you want to write a test. And then you describe it. It adds correctly, and then you pass it an arrow function. And inside of this arrow function is where you write your actual test code. So let's just say that we expect, and expect is another function that comes with Jest. So we expect 1 plus 1 to equal 2. So this is our test, and let's go run it from the command line. So we'll get out of the yarn start, and we'll just run yarn test. And then in here, it's going to tell us that we have one passing test so far, which is the it adds correctly. So we could just make that 3, and automatically it's going to tell us that it expected 3, but it received 2. So you don't have to rerun it every time, it automatically does that. So this is what a test looks like, and we'll just leave this for now, even though it's not really testing our component, it's just to show what a test looks like. So down below, we're going to test our actual components. But before we do that, let's look at a few libraries I included to help us with testing. So as I mentioned, Create React App comes with Jest, but I like to add another library called Enzyme. And Enzyme is made by Airbnb, and it's specifically to help you testing React components. You have to always include another library, which is an adapter for the version of React that you're using. So we're using 16, so that's the one we're including. We're going to include another library called Enzyme to JSON. And so when you serialize a component, so serializing is basically taking it from one function and converting it into some other version of that. So when you parse JSON, it goes from a string into a JavaScript object or array or whatnot. So that's like the serialization process. This is a little library to help us serialize things into JSON. The last thing I'm including is sign-on. And sign-on is a stubbing or mocking library, and it basically helps you create fake versions of functions. So we'll look at what this does in a little bit, but those are the libraries I added. Next is we can make some modifications that will be in place for all of our tests. So inside of the src folder, there's a file called setup tests. Zoom in there. And the name is important because this is a file that React looks for specifically with this name, allowing you to sort of modify some things about your tests before they're each run. So here we're importing React, we're importing Enzyme, and a few different functions that come with it. So shallow, render, and mount, and we'll look at what those do in a little bit. We import our adapter and our create serializer function from Enzyme to JSON, along with sign-on itself. So the first thing we can do is change the Jest serializer to be the Enzyme to JSON one here. Next thing we need to do is configure Enzyme to use the correct adapter for the version of React you're using. And this isn't required at all, but down here I've set up a bunch of globals, and that's because they're very common, going to be used in most of our tests throughout this React app. So instead of having to import them in every test file, let's just do them once here as a global, and then we can use them without importing them. And it's not something I'd recommend like in your typical React code, but for testing it works really great. All right, so now that we've got this setup in place, let's go and write our first actual test. So I'm just going to delete that one that we have here. So let's create one that just says it renders correctly. And we do our little function, arrow function here. So what we need to do is basically what you could call like instantiating or rendering or mounting our React component that we're testing. So to do that, we first need the component. So temperature from /temperature. So now we've got the component. And what we're going to do is put it into a variable called wrapper. And to do that, we'll use a function which comes from Enzyme called shallow. So to shallow, we can pass the component that we're trying to render. And, spelled temperature wrong. Let's fix that first. Okay. So if you remember that the temperature component wanted a few props. So it wanted the temp, the city, and a toggle forecast function. So we need to pass those in here. So we can pass the temp as 10, the city we'll just do as Toronto, and then the toggle forecast will be an empty arrow function. Cool. So you saw that I was importing a few different functions from Enzyme, and they all do sort of the same thing, but they're done like slightly differently depending on your use case. So what shallow does is it mounts your component, but it doesn't do the entire DOM tree. It just does like a shallow, light version of it. So that's what we're going to be using here. What render does is it basically just gives you the result of the render function, so the HTML that you wanted to output. And what mount does is it basically goes through the whole DOM tree, and you use this when you want to basically trigger DOM events like click or whatnot. So we'll use all of them in this little test here, just to show what they do. And the differences between them. So now that we've got this temperature, we've shallow rendered it, and we've got it in a wrapper, we can say expect wrapper to match snapshot. Okay, so what did this do? We come here, we can hit the A key to rerun the tests, and they're passing. So this temperature test has one test and it's passing. And now we have one snapshot test which is passing. So basically the goal of this test here is just to make sure, does this component actually work? And is the output of it sort of what I'm expecting? So when we do a shallow version of it, the first time you do a snapshot test, it creates this snapshots folder over here on the left, and it creates you one output here. So this is for our renders correctly, and basically it's making sure that when you run this, this is what I expect to happen. So I've got a styled div that has an onClick function, and it produces this. So say you change something. We can go here, we'll change it to a small c. Now when we run our test, our snapshot says, oh, wait a minute. You wanted a big C, but what I'm seeing is a small c. So either you can fix it to make it correct, or if that's what you did want, you can hit the U key, which just says here, and that will update your snapshots. So you hit U, it goes and updates the snapshots. And now if we go look at the snapshot, it's now expecting a small key. Okay, so let's write one other test, which is same sort of thing, but we'll use, instead of the shallow, we'll use the render function. So it renders correctly again. Again. So we come here, we have two passing snapshots now, but let's go look at our snapshots file. So this is the first one, and it looked like this with a styled div onClick function. But look at this other one that used render instead of shallow. Here it doesn't show us sort of which components are being used, but the actual HTML that was produced. So the div with all the different classes given to us by styled components. So depending what you're trying to test, use sort of the one that makes the most sense. But here's the two different variations of that, just so you can see them. All right, let's write another test that basically goes in and it uses Enzyme to grab one piece of text and make sure that that is, say, formatted correctly. So this isn't the full snapshot, but just like the one thing you're testing. So it formats the temp correctly. So we've got our test. I'm going to copy this render code here. But this time we're going to use the mount function to get access to the full DOM and allowing us to sort of step through it and grab the text property of it. So we want to grab the text of essentially what this large text styled component produces. So to do that, we get our wrapper and then we tell it that we want to find the large text. This is sort of like a CSS selector sort of thing. Just to digress a little bit, I'm using styled components, and if I want to be able to sort of grab the styled component large text here, I need to define it with a name. So if I come up here where it comes from, elements box. So here I've got my my large text, which is a styled span with a bunch of CSS attributes. Down here, I've given it a name, large text. Looks sort of redundant, like large text is .display name is large text, but that allows me to grab it with selectors in testing. So if you don't need to do that, you don't need to do this step, but I wanted to, so that's why it's there. Oh yeah. All right, on with the test. So we find the large text, and then I can just say, go get me the text from that. So if I just logged the console text, what I'm going to see is 10 degrees C. So it went in and selected the large text and it grabbed that back. So I'm just going to copy that. And now I can say that I expect the text to equal 10 degrees C. And now I have another passing test. So this is great if you want to sort of dive in and grab individual things, but it's also just to show that how you can use Enzyme to step through your DOM tree and grab the text property, for example. So let's write one more test to make sure, here what we're going to be testing here is to test that the toggle forecast function gets called correctly on click of this temperature box. So it calls toggle forecast on click, we'll say. And we'll do an arrow function and just close everything correctly. Okay, so we are going to mount this component again, except this time, instead of sending an empty arrow function like this, I'm going to have a spy function. So I'm just going to call it spy, and it will come from signon.spy. And I'm going to pass spy here instead of that other empty arrow function. So what is a spy? A spy is like it's like a fake function, but it allows you to ask it questions after the fact. So you can basically ask the spy like, hey, how many times were you called? What were you sent when the caller called you? Just different things like that. Were you called twice? So now that we have our spy and we have our wrapper set up to use the spy, let's trigger an actual click. So what we can do here is we can say wrapper.find, and we can just find a div, except we're going to get the first div because if you look at the structure here, temperature box is a div, so we're just going to grab the first one. You could also just find temperature box, I guess, but this is just to show a variation of that. And we're going to, what is the word? It's not trigger, I always forget. Simulate, I think it might be. Yeah. Let's just make sure. Okay, yeah, I'm right. Sorry about that. So once we find the first div, so we find all the divs, it's an array of them, you could say. We're going to access the first one, and then we're going to simulate a click event. Okay, so once we've simulated the click event, we can now ask our spy, were you called? So we can say expect spy dot, and we can go here, and there's one that's called once. So that will basically return like true or false of whether it was called once. And we can say to be true. Okay, so we've done that. Just to prove that it's working, you could say to call twice, which it wasn't, it was only called once. And now we're getting a false. So we'll switch it back to called once, and all our tests should be passing again. Okay, so that was basically what I wanted to cover here. I covered how to write your first test in Jest, and then we worked with how to check to make sure our component is rendering correctly. And we used a combination of shallow to create a shallow copy of our temperature component. And then we checked to make sure that it matches the snapshot. We did the same thing, but this time we used render instead of shallow, just to show the difference over here in what the snapshot looks like. One gives you like components, and the other gives you the actual divs with classes and whatnot. So that was that. Then we looked at how you can use Enzyme to sort of walk through your DOM tree, finding the large text component and then getting its text attribute. So we could make sure that it's formatting it a certain way. Lastly, we worked with spies for the first time. So a spy is a fake version of a function that you can ask it questions about itself. So we mounted our temperature component again, but this time used spy. We found the first div, and then we simulated a click event, and then we could go back and ask our spy, ensure that it was only called once. Just to go back, we use setup tests to basically set up things that are going to be, it's configuration that's going to be done before every test. And then I just showed which were the packages that I added to get this functionality. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day. Bye.